April 28, 1943, 200 hours, the Mid-Atlantic Gap, roughly 600 miles from the nearest land in any direction. A German U-boat sits low in the water, running on the surface in the dark, closing on a convoy his headquarters had promised him would be lightly escorted. This was the theory that had worked for 3 straight years. Find the convoy at night, stay on the surface where a U-boat was faster than almost anything that could see it in the dark, slip inside the escort screen, fire, dive only if spotted. He had done this before more than once, and come home to a hero's welcome in Lorient with a fresh row of tonnage markers painted on his conning tower. Tonight was different, and he had no way of knowing why. 200 miles away, in a plotting room in Liverpool that no U-boat captain would ever see, a small team of British officers and civilians had already placed a black marker on a chart at almost the exact position where he now sat. They had not seen him. They had heard him, a burst of radio traffic to headquarters, intercepted, bearing lines crossed, a position triangulated to within a few miles. A destroyer group had been quietly redirected 2 hours earlier, running dark, radar on, waiting. At 2:17, without warning, a shell landed close enough to lift the boat sideways in the water. He ordered a crash dive. It was already too late. Depth charges walked across the position where his boat had been minutes before and kept coming back, pattern after pattern, for 6 hours, long after any reasonable calculation said the attackers should have given up and moved on to protect the convoy instead. He did not understand it. His superiors in Lorient did not understand it either. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the Wolfpack and a man who had built his entire strategic doctrine around the calculated superiority of the U-boat arm, would spend the spring of 1943 receiving report after report that used some version of the same phrase. The enemy seems to know where we are before we attack. By the end of that May, German losses in the North Atlantic would reach a level no navy could sustain. A month German submariners would later simply call Schwarzer Mai, Black May. Dönitz did not lose the Battle of the Atlantic because his boats got worse or his crews got softer. Unit for unit, the U-boat arm of May 1943 was arguably the most experienced and best equipped force it had ever fielded. What changed was not the U-boats. What changed was a system on the other side of the ocean that had spent 3 years quietly learning to see in the dark, and by 1943 it was seeing faster than the Germans could adapt. To understand what that system was, and why the finest submarine service in the world could never build an answer to it, we need to go back to the moment the Allies were losing this exact war, and had almost no reason to believe they could turn it around. Part 1: The Golden Time. For the first 2 years of the Battle of the Atlantic, the U-boat arm did not just win, it humiliated its opponents. German submariners called the second half of 1940 Die Glückliche Zeit, the happy time. U-boat captains hunted the shipping lanes off Britain's western approaches almost unopposed, sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. A second happy time followed in early 1942 when U-boats crossed the Atlantic and found American coastal shipping running fully lit, unescorted, silhouetted against the glow of Miami and Atlantic City. Some U-boat commanders described picking off tankers within sight of the American shoreline, while beachgoers watched the fires from the sand. The numbers told the story starkly. Allied merchant losses climbed past 400,000 tons in a single month more than once in 1942. Winston Churchill would later write that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war, not the Blitz, not the threat of invasion, but the quiet mathematics of a shrinking merchant fleet against a growing wolf pack. Germany's advantages were real and structural. Dönitz had built a doctrine Rudel tactic, the Wolfpack, that let dispersed submarines concentrate rapidly against a single convoy using radio coordination, something no other navy had operationalized at the same scale. German naval intelligence B-Dienst had partially broken British naval ciphers and often knew convoy routes before the convoys sailed. German U-boat crews trained together as complete units for months before deployment, developing a cohesion British escort crews, thrown together from merchant navy reservists and hastily commissioned officers, simply did not have. By the standard measure that had decided every naval war before it, better ships, better crews, better intelligence, Germany was winning and winning clearly. And then, over about 18 months, without a single dramatic battle that made headlines the way El Alamein or Stalingrad did, the entire equation inverted. The hunters became prey. Convoys that had once been hunting grounds became killing zones for the U-boats sent to attack them. German losses climbed past what any submarine force in history had absorbed and kept fighting. Dönitz's own assessment, recorded in the German Naval War Diary in the closing days of May 1943, was blunt. The Atlantic could no longer be fought the way it had been fought, and the U-boat arm would have to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes entirely to avoid being annihilated. He withdrew his boats not because they had run out of courage. He withdrew them because something on the other side of the ocean had gotten faster than he was, and he could not identify what it was. Part 2: The system nobody could see from a conning tower. What beat the U-boat arm was not one weapon and not one tactic. It was a machine assembled out of several separate British and American institutions, each individually unglamorous, that fed into each other faster than any single German commander could track. Start with the room in Liverpool. The Western Approaches Command Plotting Room, and behind it the Submarine Tracking Room in London, ran on something almost embarrassingly simple: obsessive, centralized, constantly updated tracking of every known or suspected U-boat position fed by every source the Allies had: sightings from aircraft, radio direction-finding fixes, fragments of decoded signals, survivor debriefs from torpedoed ships, captured logbooks. The man who ran the Submarine Tracking Room for most of the war, Roger Wynne, was not a career naval officer. He was a barrister in civilian life, commissioned into the Navy on the strength of his analytical mind rather than his sea time. Wynne's team built a discipline of updating the plot constantly and trusting the aggregate picture over any single dramatic report, and convoys were rerouted around danger, sometimes by only a few dozen miles, based on inference from partial and imperfect information. Then there was direction finding, HFDF, universally nicknamed Huff-Duff. Every time a U-boat transmitted a radio signal, and Dönitz's Wolfpack tactics required frequent transmission, because coordinating dispersed boats meant talking to them, shore stations, and increasingly the escort ships themselves could take a bearing on the transmission. Cross 2 or 3 bearings and you had a fix, sometimes accurate to a few miles, often good enough to send a destroyer straight at the source before the U-boat had finished reporting the convoy's position to headquarters. German naval intelligence knew HFDF existed. What they underestimated for years was how good it had gotten, and specifically that the British had solved the engineering problem of fitting it aboard individual escort vessels, not just shore stations, so that a corvette itself could get a bearing on a U-boat's transmission in real time during the battle, not after it. Then there was the codebreaking. Ultra-intelligence, decrypted from the German naval enigma at Bletchley Park, gave the Allies periods where they could read U-boat headquarters' own signals to boats at sea almost as fast as the U-boats themselves. This was never constant. A shift to a 4-rotor Enigma variant in 1942 blacked Bletchley out of naval traffic for most of that year, and German codebreakers periodically found ways back into Allied naval ciphers too, feeding B-Dienst's own advantage. But when Ultra was flowing, it let convoys be rerouted around wolf packs that hadn't even finished assembling. Then there was the technology gap the Germans genuinely never closed. Allied aircraft and escorts began fitting centimetric radar, a shorter wavelength than anything German equipment could detect. German U-boats carried radar warning receivers, the Medoc set, tuned to the longer wavelengths the Allies had used earlier in the war. When the Allies switched to centimetric sets, U-boats lost their warning system without knowing it had happened. A U-boat running on the surface at night, believing itself invisible because its Medoc's receiver stayed silent, could be illuminated by an aircraft's lee light and attacked within seconds, with no warning at all. And underneath all of it ran the least glamorous piece of the machine: operational research. British scientists, led by figures like the physicist Patrick Blackett, were embedded directly into Coastal Command and the escort forces to apply statistical analysis to convoy tactics themselves. Their conclusions were often counterintuitive to career naval officers. Bigger convoys, not smaller ones, turned out to be statistically safer because the ratio of escorts to merchant ships mattered more than the raw size of the target. Depth charges set to explode shallower, once officers actually studied where U-boats were diving to when attacked, sank more submarines than the standard settings that had been in use for years. None of this came from admirals. It came from scientists with slide rules who were given direct access to combat data and the authority to change doctrine based on what the numbers said, not what tradition said. And finally, there was the tactical school. At Western Approaches Tactical Unit in Liverpool, escort captains rotated through a training program that used tabletop wargames, run largely by a team led by Captain Gilbert Roberts, using women's Royal Naval Service officers to play the U-boat side, to test and refine anti-submarine tactics before they were ever tried in the Atlantic. A captain could come ashore after a patrol, describe an engagement, have it wargamed and picked apart by the training staff within days, and sail back out with a revised tactic that every other escort captain rotating through the same school would learn within weeks. One of those escort captains, Commander Frederick John Walker, developed what became known as the creeping attack, one ship holding sonar contact from a distance while a second closed in slowly and silently, dropping depth charges based on the first ship's guidance rather than its own sonar, denying the U-boat any warning at all. Walker's squadron would go on to sink more U-boats than any other escort group in the war. His tactic did not stay his alone. It went straight into the tactical school's curriculum and out to every other convoy escort group within a single training cycle. Individually, none of these things was a secret weapon. Centimetric radar was just an engineering refinement. Huff-Duff was just direction finding. The tactical school was just a training program. What made it lethal was that all of it fed into the same loop continuously: contact, analysis, adjustment, retraining, redeployment, and back into contact, running in weeks, not years. Part 3: Black May, one convoy at a time. To see the loop working in real combat, look at one convoy in 1 week. ONS 5, the slow convoy that sailed westbound from Britain in the last days of April 1943, into the teeth of the largest wolfpack concentration the U-boat arm had assembled to that point, more than 40 boats organized into 3 groups directly in its path. By any measure that had decided convoy battles in 1942, ONS 5 should have been a massacre. It was slow, poorly defended on paper, and walking directly into a numerically overwhelming ambush that German headquarters had spent days assembling specifically to intercept it. Instead, over roughly a week of running battle in brutal North Atlantic weather, the escort group, reinforced mid-battle by additional support groups redirected using tracking room intelligence, sank or crippled somewhere around a dozen U-boats while losing a dozen merchant ships, an exchange rate no wolfpack action had ever produced before. Fog, ironically, worked in the escorts' favor. Radar-equipped escorts could fight blind through weather that stripped U-boats of the visual advantage they depended on for surface night attacks. German U-boat crews who survived the action described being attacked out of weather they were certain provided total concealment, by escorts that seemed to know exactly where to point their guns before a periscope or a wake was ever visible. Dönitz's own son, serving aboard U-954, was lost in the same operational window, one name among the roughly 1,000 German submariners who would not come home from the month of May 1943 alone. Within days of ONS 5, the after-action material was already moving through the machine. Escort captains debriefed at Liverpool. The tactical school incorporated the specific weather and radar conditions of the battle into its next wargaming cycle. Depth charge settings, radar procedures, and Huff-Duff cross-referencing techniques refined during the fight were disseminated to escort groups still at sea within the same operational cycle, sometimes literally by signal, updating a doctrine that a captain would be using again before the month was out. The U-boat arm had no equivalent loop running in the other direction. A U-boat captain's report went up a chain of command that filtered hard-won tactical lessons through a headquarters increasingly reluctant to report bad news up to Berlin, and there was no equivalent of the Liverpool Tactical School translating individual captains' battle experience into a training curriculum that reached every other captain within weeks. Individual U-boat aces remained brilliant. The service around them was not getting collectively smarter at anywhere near the rate its opponents were. By the last week of May 1943, German losses for the month had reached a level Dönitz would describe in his own diary as unsustainable. On May 24th, he ordered the North Atlantic Wolfpacks withdrawn, effectively conceding the central battle of the naval war, less than a month after ONS 5 had ended. He had not lost his best boats to bad luck. He had lost the race between 2 learning systems, and his own crews had been the ones paying for it. If you've had family who served in the Merchant Marine, the escort navies, or the U-boat service on either side of this fight, I'd be glad to hear about them in the comments. Most of what actually happened out there never made it into the official histories. Part 4: The gap closes faster than anyone expected. If the U-boat arms collapse in the North Atlantic had taken most of 1942 and the first months of 1943 to reach its breaking point, the Mid-Atlantic air gap, the one stretch of ocean U-boats had reliably been able to operate beyond the range of Allied land-based aircraft, closed in a matter of months once the Allies decided to close it. For most of the war, aircraft based in Newfoundland, Iceland, and Northern Ireland could not reach the middle of the Atlantic, leaving a corridor several hundred miles wide where U-boats could surface, recharge batteries, and coordinate attacks with no aerial threat at all. Every convoy planner on both sides knew exactly where this gap was. It was arguably the single most important piece of geography in the entire naval war, and for years neither side could do much to change it. Solution, once it came, was almost embarrassingly direct: extend the range. Very long-range Liberator bombers, stripped of non-essential armor and fitted with extra fuel tanks, could finally reach deep into the gap from bases on both sides of the Atlantic. Escort carriers, small, hastily built aircraft carriers converted from merchant hulls, began sailing with the convoys themselves, putting continuous air cover over ships in exactly the stretch of ocean where none had ever existed. The closing of the gap did not happen because someone invented a miracle aircraft. The airframe existed already. What changed was that the tracking rooms, the operational research teams, and the shipping allocation staffs finally agreed, under wartime pressure, to prioritize modifying existing aircraft and diverting existing escort carrier hulls specifically to close this one measured vulnerability, and to do it in months rather than the years such reallocations normally took in peacetime naval bureaucracies. For a U-boat captain who had operated in that gap for 2 years, treating it as the one reliable sanctuary on the entire crossing, its disappearance within a single operational season was simply inexplicable. There was no new German intelligence failure that explained it, no single battle that revealed it. The sanctuary was there in January. It was gone by summer. Command in Lorient could describe the fact of what had happened. They could not describe, in any report that survives, how an enemy navy had reallocated aircraft and escort carriers across an entire ocean that quickly. War is expensive to fight and expensive to remember correctly. If this kind of forensic naval history is something you want more of, the like button costs you nothing and tells me you want the next one. Part 5: The Verdict: Why the U-boat arm could never build the same machine. The final question is the one Dönitz's own staff never fully answered, even after the war, in interrogations where they had every reason to be candid about what had gone wrong. Why couldn't Germany simply copy the Allied system once its outline became clear? The first reason was where insight was allowed to originate. German naval doctrine, like German army doctrine, concentrated tactical judgment in commanders and prized individual seamanship and initiative, real virtues that produced genuinely brilliant U-boat captains. What it did not build was an institution whose entire job was to take a junior escort captain's half-formed tactical idea, wargame it against a team of analysts within days, and push a validated version of it out to every other captain in the service within weeks. Walker's creeping attack became doctrine for the entire Royal Navy escort force almost as fast as he could describe it to the tactical school. Nothing in the German system moved a comparable insight from one U-boat's control room to the rest of the fleet at a comparable speed. The second reason was what could be honestly reported upward. British and American operational research teams were handed uncomfortable combat data and told to find the truth in it, even when the truth embarrassed existing doctrine. The depth charge setting analysis is the clearest example, since it meant admitting years of standard practice had been quietly wrong. German Naval Command by 1943 was operating under a political culture increasingly hostile to any report that suggested the war was going badly, a pressure that grew worse as the war continued and made its way steadily up the chain from the Army to the Navy as well. Honest reporting was the raw fuel the Allied learning loop ran on. It was a liability in Berlin. The third reason was industrial and scientific capacity to act on what was learned. Even once a lesson was identified, closing the mid-Atlantic gap meant building or converting escort carriers, extending the range of existing bombers, and manufacturing centimetric radar sets by the thousand, a scale of production and scientific mobilization that outstripped what German industry, already stretched by the war on land, could match in the same window of time. The Allies could not just identify a fix. They could manufacture it fleet-wide in months. Put those three things together, and you have the answer that eluded every U-boat captain who ever asked how the enemy kept finding him in the dark. It was not that Allied sonar operators were more gifted than German lookouts, and it was not that British depth charges were mechanically superior to German ones in isolation. It was that one side had built an institution where a captain's tactical idea, a scientist's statistical finding, and an engineer's radar refinement could all reach the entire fleet within roughly the same span of weeks it took the other side's headquarters merely to decide whether a bad report was safe to forward. Return to that night in April 1943, in the dark, 600 miles from land. The U-boat captain waiting for dawn does not know that his position has already been triangulated by a direction-finding bearing crossed with a partial decrypt in a room in London he will never see, or that the depth charge pattern about to fall on him has been recalculated in the last 6 months by a physicist who has never set foot on a warship. He cannot see any of it. He only sees the sea and then the flash and then the water coming in. He will never fully understand what beat him. Neither will Dönitz, not really, not in a way he could act on in time to save the boats still on their way out from Lorient. The U-boat arm did not lose the Battle of the Atlantic because its crews were less brave or less skilled than they had been in 1940. Man for man, boat for boat, the German submarine service remained one of the most dangerous naval forces in the world until the last months of the war. What it lost was the race of adaptation, a race being run not on any single ocean crossing, but in tracking rooms, tactical schools, and research offices thousands of miles from any conning tower every single week for years. Roger Wynne went back to practicing law after the war and rarely spoke publicly about the Submarine Tracking Room. Frederick John Walker died of a stroke in 1944 at the height of his success, exhausted from more than 2 years of continuous escort duty, and was given a funeral with full naval honors that drew thousands of mourners in Liverpool. Most of the young women's Royal Naval Service officers who ran the war games at the tactical school, whose work quietly rewrote how the war at sea was fought, are not named in most popular histories of the battle at all. The captains have their memoirs, the scientists and the plotting room officers mostly do not. If this kind of forensic account of how the Atlantic was actually won is worth your time, subscribe for the next one, because the story of how a handful of scientists, codebreakers, and escort captains quietly outlearned the finest submarine service afloat is one that most of the popular history of this war still gets wrong.